Hi, my name is Sporsem and I'm a researcher at SINTEF in Trondheim, Norway. I'm going to present to you the paper called Understanding Barriers to Internal Startups in Large Organizations. Evidence from a globally distributed company. I wrote this paper together with my good colleagues Anastasiia Tkalich, Nils Brede and Marius Mikalsen. Okay, let's just start. Today, startup companies are popping up all over the place, and they are challenging the position of large companies. They're typically clever, they work fast, and they're super agile. In our case, Marcomp is feeling the pressure. They are a provider of business-to-business services within the maritime industries. They have more than 13,000 employees located in more than 100 different countries. And in a world that is digitally transforming fast, they need to make new software products to keep up with the competition. But innovation is something that comes naturally for a startup company. And it seems to be a bit harder for these large global companies. Therefore, large companies need to come up with strategies to sustain the development of new products and features. One of these strategies is relying on internal startups, which are almost like a normal startup, but within their company. The purpose is to leverage the same advantages as the competing startup companies and become just as fast. So, Marcomp came up with this framework where employees could pitch ideas and start internal startups to develop digital products. And the framework was heavily inspired by Eric Ries's Lean startup. But large global companies will naturally meet barriers that restrict their ability to mimic their competing startups and exploit their advantages. Therefore, we asked the research question: what are the barriers to software product innovation speed in a large company? Earlier research shows us that internal startups can be hindered due to bureaucracy. Barriers can be several layers of approval, lack of necessary autonomy, interference with existing business model, and low fit with the standards and procedures of the organization. So why is this research question important? It seems that we got some answers. Well, a systematic literature review by Edison et al. Showed very few studies in the topic and identified a need for empirical cases. So, to answer this question, we followed 5 internal startups within Marcomp for almost a year. We did 10 interviews and we took part in 15 workshops, communities of practice meetings and innovation board meetings. And our analysis showed us that there is mainly 6 barriers to internal startups. I only have time to present 2 of them, but you can read about the rest in our paper. So, the first barrier we identified, we called late involvement of software developers. Marcomp, they wanted proof of a concept before investing development resources. So, late involvement of software developers was actually a strategy to save costs. This became barriers for the internal startups. Firstly, not identifying the technical risks early forced internal startups to redesign their solutions later on because developers identify them as impossible to develop. Secondly, developers need concrete user stories, prioritized feature lists, security analysis, etc. when they develop a product. This was something that was not thought of by the internal startups and resulted in them having to do much rework and rewrite documentation. And they even had to collect additional information for the developers. The second barrier we identified was managers that wanted to be involved in most decision making. Internal startups spent much time on anchoring decisions among the managers in, for example, marketing, finance, business development, and so forth. The managers often ask questions doubting the product and doubting the startup's strategy. In one example, a line manager and a sales expert had different opinions on which pricing model to opt for. This led to delays for one internal startup because they had to start validating their pricing decisions instead of actually working on the product. We found one example on an attempt to speed up these decision-making processes by a startup that established a steering committee. This steering committee consisted of key managers and experts. Together, they made critical decisions and made sure that the decisions were aligned with the company's objectives. This internal startup later explained that when managers sought to influence a decision, they could refer them back to the steering committee instead of handling the problem themselves. And this freed up much time to work on the actual product. So now we come to the key takeaway from this presentation and actually from the article. What we found through our analysis is that most barriers are related to a poor integration between business strategy and software development. So we started exploring explanations to why this is such a complex problem. And we found that Fitzgerald and Stool came up with this framework that describes how an integration between business and development is important to keep continuity in software development. They actually coined this a term, BizDev. They argue that such integration between business and development is a prerequisite for flow in software development. We argue in the same way, that this integration was the essence of the internal startup's challenges. We show that BizDev is important for continuity not only in software development, but also in innovation speed. I like to use an often cited metaphor to describe this: the race between the hare and the tortoise. Most of us know that the slow but consistent tortoise wins against the speedy hare that occasionally does off. In our case, the hare is the startups. They doze off because they meet barriers and end up losing to the tortoise. If our internal startups can learn how to overcome the barriers or mitigate the barriers, they will be unbeatable.
So thank you, Tor and colleagues, for the pre-recorded video presentation. Very interesting. At the moment, we do not have a question in the chat already. So maybe the first question that I would like to ask is, how did you get access to the internal startups in order to conduct your study?
Thank you for the question. We are actually in a 4-year project with this company, and it's funded through the Norwegian Research Council, and we're helping this company on their digital transformation journey. So it's both them and us actually don't know what this journey will look like. So we're trying to figure that out as we go. So we're fishing for interesting problem statements that they are interested in and trying to scope them to what's hot in research. And then we come up with ideas on what to study. And if they find it interesting, we gain full access, more or less. And then we're like it feels like we're almost like employees, following the cases, talking to them. Of course, now during COVID, we're doing everything virtually. But usually we will probably run around in their halls, participate in meetings, and doing observations and interviews. So how we got it? First and foremost, we got this 4-year project. So this is like our framework for the corporation, and then we just try to pitch and ask them what they find interesting. Hopefully, it's interesting for research too.
Yeah, I hope that for you too. So we have a question by Parastu. So there's no self-organization so that software developers can choose to participate in a startup?
Yeah, there's not no clear-cut answer to this. It seems that some startups, they got personal connections to software developers, and with that personal connection, they can ask for help. And then this developer will probably ask their boss or manager if they can participate. And it seems that they're quite free to use their flexibility in this way, while others they are assigned after a proof of concept. So it depends. It differs from culture to culture in the different departments.
Okay, and we have another question by John Knoll. I missed the first part of your talk, so you may have answered this question already. Did you find a mismatch between internal startup views of risk and the attitude toward risk and failure of the sponsoring organization? Interesting question.
I'm not quite sure if I understood this question correctly, but I'll try. Yes, we did. The sponsoring organization think that, or they see other risks than the internal startups. It seems that the internal startups are seeing more local risks that are threatening their idea or their way forward, while the sponsoring organization, they are seeing risks to business models, existing business models, and especially that the big business models or the big products or services that they are already providing. If some of these internal startups are threatening these big revenue products, then they get nervous and they see it as a risk. While the internal startups, they don't see this as, they see it as a risk, but it's not in front of their in their mind. They're more focused on their more technical and operative risks related to them developing their product.
Okay, we have another question by Ita Richardson, but I think we will not have the time to answer it before this session ends. So I would like to invite you to continue and answer this question in the private discussion room right afterwards. And there you may also learn more about the other barriers. So in your paper, you identified 6 barriers. In the presentation, we saw 2. And maybe some people are interested in learning more about the other 4 as well. So thanks, Tor, and all the other presenters in this session again. And we have a 10 minutes break and then meet again. Thank you.